In a few minutes, we'll hear from the report's author, Professor Andrew Markus, who will take us through this year's findings. But to set the scene, let's take a look at some of this year's key findings.
Australia, a diverse multicultural society, has experienced significant population growth in recent years. Immigration has been a major factor. The Mapping Social Cohesion research provides detailed insight into Australia's social cohesion, immigration and population issues. It is the largest study of its kind. Its findings help to understand the social impact of Australia's increasingly diverse immigration program. Core to this is the Scanlon Monash Index. This looks at 5 indicators of social cohesion: belonging, worth, social justice, participation and acceptance and rejection. In 2014, the Scanlon Monash Index showed Australia remains a highly cohesive society by international standards. 4 of the 5 indicators of social cohesion ranked higher than in 2013. The good news is that according to world rankings, Australia comes out at the top or near the top of socially cohesive nations. Most people have a positive identification with Australia. Surveying third-generation Australians further highlights very high levels of identification. Only 3% of people say they feel that they don't belong in Australia. Most people also agree that there is economic opportunity and reward for hard work, and are generally satisfied with their personal financial circumstances. Taking all things into account, 9 out of 10 people say they are happy with their lives. As for the perceived problems facing Australia, public concern over asylum seekers arriving by boat has dropped. In 2013, the issue was considered a major problem facing Australia, but in 2014, less than 4% of people held the same view. A number of surveys have found a high level of support for government policy relating to asylum seeker arrivals by boat. The 2014 Scanlon Foundation survey finds that only 1 in 4 people support asylum seekers arriving by boat being eligible for permanent settlement. According to the 2014 results, public concern about immigration levels also dropped to the lowest level across the 7 Scanlon Foundation surveys beginning in 2007. This finding is surprising given wider economic concerns and higher unemployment. The good news continues when it comes to Australia's view of police and the justice system. A large majority of Australians, 84%, have a positive opinion of the police. Positive opinion of the courts was also high, albeit lower than the police at 73%. This positive sentiment toward police and the legal system is a crucial factor for a cohesive society. However, the report also highlights some challenges for our nation. There are concerns about the workings of Australian democracy. Trust in government remains well below the level recorded between 2007 and 2009. While 88% of people agree that democracy, whatever its problems, is the best system of government, just 15% of people agree that the system works well, as it is in Australia. Reported experience of discrimination on the basis of skin colour, ethnic origin and religion has remained close to the highest level recorded at 18% in 2014. Close to 5% of the sample said they experienced discrimination at least once a month in the last year. Looking back to the benchmark level in 2007, the biggest change in the Scanlon Monash Index of Social Cohesion has been in the area of acceptance and rejection. This has fallen by almost 30 index points. Negative views toward Muslim faith groups are almost 5 times higher than negative views toward other religious groups, such as the Christian and Buddhist faiths. And among third-generation Australians, this negative sentiment is higher. While overall Australia's strong support for multiculturalism continues, taking a closer look, there are differences within the community. While a large majority of third-generation Australians agree that people of different backgrounds get on well, that they like getting to know people from other cultures, and are positive about the value of multiculturalism, the majority does not agree with entrenched cultural and ethnic difference in our society. third-generation Australians are divided in their expectations of immigrants. When presented with the statement that it is best if people forget their different ethnic and cultural backgrounds as soon as possible, 36% of people disagree and 38% agree, while 27% are unsure. So while Australia remains by and large a unified society, Scanlon Foundation surveys provide mixed results. After 8 years, the Scanlon Monash Index remains more than 10 index points below the 2007 benchmark. By continuing to map social attitudes, we can define, discuss and address the challenges facing contemporary Australia.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we please welcome the report's author, Professor Andrew Markus, to the stage.
First of all, could I thank the Victorian Parliament for hosting this event? Thank you very much. And for your very kind words of introduction. I acknowledge the Scanlon Foundation for its support of this work. We wouldn't have much knowledge in this space if it was not for the Scanlon Foundation. I make the point that the Scanlon Foundation is not even mainly about supporting university research, but about making a difference both in sustaining an informed community and informed decision-making, but also in programs which affect people's lives. And so one of the pieces of literature that you would have picked up is the Community Hub's newsletter, which is a very significant initiative of the Foundation, and Mr. Tony Fry, who's the director of that. So it's a very significant initiative going forward, as well as a number of other programs. So you'll excuse me if I won't proceed with the acknowledgements, other than, of course, to make the acknowledgements that we all make. We pay our respects for the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people, and pay respect to their elders past and present. All right, if I just take you through now, and quite quickly, because I think we want to also make sure that we've got time for the panel discussion, so I'll move through this quite quickly. This country is a country of immigration, and the immigration is continuing apace. If you just think, for example, that the population has increased by 4 million since 2000, you sort of have to scratch yourself, don't you, and think, how's that possible? That is a lot of people. Now, they're not all immigrants. About 40% of that increase are people who are born in Australia, but 60% are immigrants. So it would be a very different country without that very large ongoing immigration program. And currently, Australia is experiencing growth rate 1.8 to 1.7%, historically very high figures. And this is highlighted here that the build-up of immigration, natural increase in the 2000s, a slump in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, but again, that has picked up and is now probably stabilising, but at a high level. If we now just focus on the Scanlon Foundation surveys, which have been going since 2007, as you heard, we now have a total database of 24,000 respondents. And this year we did 3 surveys, not one survey. We did a national survey, we did an experimental online survey of third-generation Australians. Now, third-generation Australians are defined here as people who are born in Australia with both parents born in Australia. They could be 4th, 5th, 6th generation. They comprise 48% of the adult population, nearly half the adult population. And they're distinctive because they're almost exclusively of Anglo-Celtic background. Within that group, about 95% of people indicate their ancestry as Australian, English, Irish. The third survey that we did this time was done just last week. Because the question arose as we began our briefings and as we reflected on the findings, we really needed to know, if at all possible, what's been the impact of the discussion that has been raging in our community about issues of security, of threats, of conflicts in the Middle East, of young men and women going overseas to join forces combatants in the Middle East. So what has been the impact of that? And we've been fortunate because we work with probably the premier survey company in this country, the Social Research Centre. And I think I noticed Darren walking in here. Hi, Darren. You did the impossible because last week in 2 days you did a snap poll for us, and the organisation actually now linked to the ANU to really advance knowledge of surveying, because one of the things that we wanted to do in this survey is to better understand opinion. It's not enough just to get numbers. We want to understand, are they significant? Are they real? In particular, what is the impact if you do a survey administered by an interviewer as opposed to a survey that's completed in the privacy of one's own computer when it's completed online? So you'll find in this report extensive discussion of our findings here. What I'm doing is in effect charting the terrain but not filling in the spaces. And it's for you, I hope that you will take the trouble to read this report and to understand, but I'm giving you, building on that excellent video, some of the key issues to be looking out for. I should also say that one last point, one acknowledgement, that I also work with colleagues at the Australian National University. So you'll find there some statistical analysis of some of the findings with regard to the third generation Australians. So they also made a significant contribution. All right, so 65 questions, unheralded, unprecedented capacity to track change over time. That's what really we bring here. And the utmost rigour to surveying. So not what can we do with this amount of dollars, but how can we actually do the best possible job to understand Australian opinion. And what we then bring to this study this time is triangulation, meaning we can look at data both from the point of view of that national survey, the online survey, and then thirdly, the snap poll that was conducted last week. The areas that we can cover in this discussion today, and quite briefly, the Scanlon Monash Index, issues to do with immigration and asylum, attitudes to multiculturalism, to government, and then very briefly, third generation Australians. The Scanlon Monash Index provides us with a snapshot overview of where we are going as a society. It's 18 questions chosen for their statistical relevance to the issues that we're concerned with. And, you know, at the end of the day, with all this massive data, what is it really telling us? What it tells us is that we have essentially stability compared to last year or the year before, but we're 10 index points lower than when we started. We'd like to be 10 index points higher. In the context of the challenges that we face as a society, we are facing challenges and we're going probably in the wrong direction. So that's certainly an issue for the future. Nonetheless, 4 of our 5 indicators are trending upwards. The one indicator that's trending downwards is not going to surprise any of us. It's people's sense of social justice and equity. In the context of last year's budget and various belt-tightening measures, there is an increase in the proportion of people who are concerned about social justice in this society. But you will see that 4 of those indicators are still in the range 90 to 100. One, however, is much lower, and that's what labelled acceptance and rejection. If it was going in the right direction, acceptance, it would be 110. If it's going in the wrong direction, that is, people's sense of rejection is increasing, then the numbers are getting smaller. And you can see there that that's around 70. So that's atypical in terms of our 5 indicators, and that's one of the really important challenges. in terms of the ranking of issues, because the first question we have in our survey is we ask people, what is the most important issue facing Australia? We're not putting ideas into their heads, it's open-ended, and then we code the responses. And probably the most significant changes that we've detected have been an increase in concern about the economy, at a much lower level, but nonetheless an increasing trend about quality of governance. And interestingly, a development in the last 12 months has been that the asylum issue has dropped much lower in terms of people's consciousness. It's basically dropping out of the top 5 issues. When we look at attitudes to asylum seekers and we present 4 options for people, we ask, and we've been doing this since 2010 consistently, what should the government be doing in this space? And those people who consider that asylum seekers who come to Australia by boat should be eligible for permanent settlement has consistently been a small minority, 20 to 25%. And it has trended upwards, so I'd say it's in the range 20 to 25. It's getting to the top of that range, but it's not outside that range. Also, very interestingly, you'll find in the report there are like 8 tables which look at a number of different demographics. Age, what state do you live in, level of financial circumstances, who would you vote for? And when we look at all of those categories, there's only one category where more than 35% of people consider that if you come by boat, you should be eligible for permanent resettlement in Australia. That one category is people who indicate that they would vote for the Greens. For them, it's 64%. But interestingly, no other category goes above 35%. That's an unusual degree of coherence in a society, because when we look at other questions and we analyse them, we find much greater differentiation. You know, sometimes people say, well, what we're dealing with here when we look at attitudes to asylum seekers is entrenched Australian bigotry, that this is a legacy of the white Australia days. Well, I think that the people who say that should actually have a look at the data. Because, for example, we find that immigrants from non-English speaking backgrounds are even more negative than the Australian born. So if that hypothesis was true, and this is a function of old Australian bigotries, it would be the other way around. Third generation Australians would be off the scale and immigrants would be 50% in support, but that's not what the data shows. So there's a very interesting and important finding. Now we have this other quite significant finding in this space. When we ask people, what do you think of the number of immigrants coming to Australia? Are the numbers too high? Are they about right, or are they too low? And quite surprisingly, over the last 12 months, the proportion who think that it's too high has gone from 42 to 35. That is a mystery, because in the current environment, the current economic environment, it should have gone from 42 to 52. It should have gone in the other direction by quite a large margin. It went the other way. What explains that? Well, we may have different views on it. The only way that I can explain it is that there's greater level of confidence that the government is effectively handling border control, that the government is effectively handling that space in people's minds. Because as I've shown you, concern about asylum seekers has gone down. So again, you'll find quite a lot of discussion in the report on this issue. You see, another hypothesis is that we got the numbers wrong. The survey is not reliable. Contrary to that, however, there were 2 earlier surveys this year, the Lowy Institute poll and a news poll, which both recorded very low numbers of concern. And then when we conducted the SNAP poll last week, again, the numbers had hardly moved. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, and for us to think through. In a wider context, and if you focus on Europe, one of the major challenges of European countries is that having established the EU, there are no longer control of movement across borders within the EU. You know, I well remember going to England more than 10 years ago to a conference, and there was a presentation by a Member of Parliament and others. And the point was made, one of the big issues in England today is that we don't know who's coming and we don't know who's going. We don't have effective border control and we don't have effective statistics even. This is not what characterises Australia. So I would make the point for your consideration that effective border control is a vital ingredient for a cohesive community. Again, if we compare Australia to European countries, so we're 35% negative. We have polling from Europe which is in the range 60 to 75% negative with regard to government handling of immigration, even though some of these countries don't have immigration anymore. But still, that is very strong because people's perceptions aren't necessarily geared to the real world. Government, and very quickly just to move through this, one of the characteristics that we have in Australian society, we're not unique, low levels of trust in politicians and in the institution of Parliament, and that's a concern. It's not new. We had a collapse of trust in the federal government between 2009 and 2010, and this is the period of the Rudd government, and it didn't really recover. When we ask this question, would you say that the system of government that we have in Australia works fine and other options? Just 15% of people say that it works fine, whereas nearly 1/3 of people will say it needs major change or it should be replaced. So that ratio, the 2-to-1 ratio is a concern. When we look at levels of intolerance, what we find, and I place more emphasis on the ratios rather than the exact proportions, because depending on how you survey, you get different answers. But the ratio of negativity to Muslim Australians is 5-to-1 more negative than it is towards people of the Buddhist or Christian faith. So however you look at that data, it is an important issue. We have, as you saw, this ongoing experience of high levels of discrimination reported by 1 in 20 people. And when we look at that broken down by different backgrounds, we find that that's the overall figure. If we want to look at people of non-English speaking backgrounds, it'll be twice that level. If we look at specific national groups, it could be 4 times or 3 times that level. And we well know that the violence against Indian students and the way that it was covered in the media and perceptions of that did tremendous damage, not only to the social fabric of this country, but to the economy of this country. The number of Indian students in Australia today has fallen from something like 90,000 to closer to 30,000, whereas other national groups have hardly moved. Now that's a very important statistic that should give us pause. With regard now to multiculturalism and divided values, when we ask a general question, which is about whether it's been good or bad for Australia, we find that multiculturalism as a concept is very strong, and is stronger in Victoria probably than any other part of Australia, and then the data shows us that. For example, it's been good for Australia, very good. Victoria, you can see, is 43%, New South Wales is 35%. So I think there's a lesson there that it works. I'm going to actually now move on, because I'm really conscious of the time, just to look at some key points, and then I want to talk to you about our SNAP survey. So in terms of the key points, the positives that we can take out from this survey is that Australia is probably one of the most accepting countries of immigration from diverse sources. There's no question about that. The Scanlon Monash index is stabilised. We'd like it to be going up, but stabilisation is better than negative trends. Belonging and life satisfaction indicators continue to be very high in Australia. Very high levels of trust in the police force, something I didn't get a chance to cover, but you saw that in the video presentation. The proportion who have low levels of trust in the police, it's like 15, 16%. If you go to Eastern Europe, for example, Russia, it's like 65%. You go to Pakistan and it's much more. So that's a very important element. And I can't say enough of the efforts of the Victoria Police, certainly at the level of the leadership of the Victorian Police in constructive dialogue, opening bridges to communities. I think we probably lead the world in this regard. Immigration, the high levels of acceptance, and diversity I mentioned. The challenges are to do with the fact that we're 10 points lower in our social cohesion index. The trust in government has been low. Levels of discrimination, multiculturalism, I didn't really get enough chance to talk about that, but there's a lot of discussion in the report. What does it mean when people say that multiculturalism has been good for Australia? And if I had to give a one-line response to that, what Australians favour about multiculturalism is a policy which is good for the economy and which helps to integrate immigrants. It's not much support for entrenched cultural difference. Multiculturalism is seen as good, and that's how I would interpret the data, because it helps immigrants integrate into Australian society. So that's where we were in June, July. Now, what about our SNAP poll? And again, like you've got the results there, and I've run out of time to be able to discuss these. But what we did was we took 12 questions and we asked in pretty much the same order that they were asked in the national poll. And because the survey was done over just 2 days, we had 500 respondents. So there's an increased margin of error. You would have seen reports in The Age today over some of these statistics. But they have to put statistics on a page and sell a newspaper. Most of the material that they're quoting is not statistically different. Okay, if you go from 12% to 15% with a margin of error of, say, 5%, it's not in the level of statistical significance. So that little handout that you've got actually highlights the change which is statistically significant and the change which is within the margin of error. But to give you an overview, what is particularly significant in this SNAP poll is that attitudes to immigration, to multiculturalism and to faith groups has not changed. There was an expectation that they may well have changed given the tenor of public debate, but that they had not moved at any level of statistical significance. And in one way that's very positive, but before we all sort of have a cup of tea and pat ourselves on the back, this is in the context in which attitudes to Muslim Australians were negative at a level that was overdetermined. When I say overdetermined, that means that if you want trouble in your society and the potential for trouble to develop in your society at a level much greater than you have at the moment, we're already there. In a situation when 10 to 15% of the population are already highly negative, you don't need to go to 30% because it's already overdetermined, and that again highlights the challenges that we face going forward. Interestingly, the changes that occurred were more on this side of the ledger. People's perception of the problems facing Australia shifted. They took their eyes off the problems of governance, and in fact, level of trust in government went up. I interpret that to mean that the Prime Minister's leadership in this space, however you want to interpret it, is being well received. Because when we match demographics, and the data is different because we're matching the demographics of the SNAP poll and taking a section of the main survey, it went from 26 to 36%. Now, for that indicator, that's a lot of movement. We also found that sense of belonging and adherence to the Australian way of life also moved very significantly. That question, when we asked, do you think that in the modern world it's important to maintain the Australian way of life, those people who strongly agreed, not agreed and strongly agreed, but strongly agreed, went from 49% to 71%. That's a huge movement, given that it's an indicator that, and you can look at the data in the report, that hadn't actually moved much before. So sense of nationalism and buy-in to the Australian way of life increased markedly. And trust in government also increased. So some of those indicators, to wind up, some of those indicators are what we would expect. We would expect that in a time of heightened concern, if the government is showing leadership, it will be supported. We would expect that in a time of heightened concern about security, affirmation of Australian values would go up. Interestingly, however, we didn't witness a targeting of the outgroups, because that number didn't go up. So we didn't see the displacement of those concerns on the immigration program. We didn't see a displacement of that concern on multiculturalism, because those numbers stayed the same. All right, so in conclusion, I hope that you will find the report useful. All I've been able to do is just provide a brief overview. We'll be discussing some of these issues further later on. Thank you.